I won't reveal who I am, or much about where I live, and to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened. But I just came to terms with it now, and I have to warn people about what's out there, what they knew, what we don't. Warning, this is a very long read, and some of the content below is very disturbing, but I can't hold back. Here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we knew the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people considered sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in a church. You don't let American flags touch the ground. You don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway. And since no one else was going, he'd managed to goad me into going with him. That's another one of my hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he had been there before, though only once. His manipulative ploy had been to get me to come with, so he could show me. He admitted this all in the casual way that friends admit being asses to friends. Sometimes I didn't blame him. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from the town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Ute didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to urinate. I stepped off the main road just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past a shallow creek with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me as I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other end, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget. Though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, and brush. But suddenly, it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange. Not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color. And as I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them. Symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that the circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around as if they had actually been a perfect brick wall, and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only halfway over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There were no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many other locals might share my sentiments. But we were there all day, and we didn't run into anybody. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started getting really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we'd be walking these 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating lunch. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear rustling of the brush. I looked and I saw the foliage and vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees, and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed that it was making far too much noise, and was doing so far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have the time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off or something like that. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me, because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time it was funny. "Hey, Buck. Yeah, you. Leave us alone." He walked off the road and disappeared down a ridge, behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. "Mark?" I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. "Mark!" I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far, I knew, because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there were signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. "Mark!" I called out, furiously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. "Mark," I murmured, then called out again. "Mark!" Something heard me, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard a rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the foliage and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please give me a second. I've spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself this wasn't real. At first I saw a head, the head of a buck. But it came forward, and I realized that it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring at a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared looking even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. But there was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all like the horns of the average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized. A mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked. I remember both of its arms and legs. They started human, but near the bottom they started distorting and became animalistic. At the ends of its legs were powerful hooves. At the ends of its arms were long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws, Mark's body was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had been once. For a moment there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body apathetically and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang suddenly. It's gonna jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction of the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt, and then a scuffle of a monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all my life, but it was gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping that I was going in the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and I gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow, I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore, but I didn't care. I kept running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up at the trail, at the point where it went up between two mountains and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there near the beginning of the trail was the skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail, and it didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me, though I need to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in dreams, nightmares. That creature, the skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite. Because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's mutilated corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle, left alone for so long, that had been quietly disturbed.